The first wedding guest who saw the pigs thought it was some kind of surprise entertainment. The second guest started screaming. By the time pig number 20 crashed through a flower display, worth more than my first pickup truck, 300 people were running across the lawn of Cedar Ridge Manor like they were escaping a natural disaster. The bride was crying, the groom was yelling, champagne glasses were shattering everywhere, and standing in the middle of all that chaos was a man named Preston Whitmore, staring at me with the kind of expression you only get when karma finally arrives with a delivery receipt. Now, before anybody decides I was some crazy farmer who released 40 hogs into a wedding for fun, let me explain how we got there, because trust me, those pigs weren't the beginning of the story. They were the ending. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for almost 3 decades, I've owned one of the oldest heirloom apple orchards in western Pennsylvania. Every morning before sunrise, I'd walk those rows, checking branches, trimming growth, watching the fruit develop. Some people see apple trees. I see 30 years of work. I see my retirement. I see memories of my late father teaching me how to graft branches when I was 12 years old. My orchard wasn't some commercial factory operation either. It was specialized. 23 varieties of heirloom apples that grocery stores can't easily find. Crimson Bed, Gold Rush, Ashmead's Kernel, Wine Sap, apples people drove hours to buy. Chefs love them. Bakers love them. Tourists love them. And honestly, I love them too. Right next to my property sat Cedar Ridge Manor, a luxury wedding and event venue built on what used to be farmland decades ago. For years we got along just fine. Their guests enjoyed the scenery, took photos near the fence line, admired the orchard, and everybody respected boundaries. Then everything changed when Preston Whitmore became their new events director. Preston was one of those guys who walked into every room like he was already the smartest person there. Expensive shoes, expensive watch, city attitude. He specialized in what he called authentic rural experiences. You know the type. A guy who'd never milked a cow in his life, but suddenly became an expert on farm culture because wealthy clients were willing to pay extra for rustic aesthetics. About 18 months before the wedding disaster, Preston approached me with what sounded like a business proposal. He wanted to buy apples from my orchard for weddings and corporate events. At first I was interested. It sounded reasonable. Local business helping local business. Then he named his price. $2 per bushel. I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. My apples routinely sold for 7 times that amount. I explained the economics, the labor, the maintenance, the quality. Preston stood there smirking like I'd missed the point. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Danny, you're looking at this wrong. I'm offering exposure. Once our clients see your fruit, your little orchard will become famous." My little orchard. 30 years of work reduced to my little orchard. I politely declined and told him if he wanted premium fruit, he'd have to pay premium prices. His smile disappeared immediately. That's when I saw the real Preston. He leaned against the fence and said, "Fine, I'll find another way." At the time I thought he meant another supplier. Turns out I gave him too much credit. A few weeks later, I noticed apples disappearing from trees near the property line. Not many, just enough to notice. I blamed deer. Then I blamed teenagers. Then entire branches started getting stripped overnight. Perfect fruit, only the best varieties. Whoever was taking them knew exactly what they were doing. The losses kept growing. By mid-season, I knew something wasn't right. So I installed hidden trail cameras throughout the orchard. Honestly, I expected wildlife footage. Maybe raccoons. Maybe local kids. Why God instead made my stomach drop. There on the screen was Preston. Not alone either. Several catering employees from Cedar Ridge Manor were carrying baskets and crates through my orchard after dark. They moved confidently, efficiently, like they'd done it dozens of times. They filled containers with my best apples and hauled them back toward the venue kitchen. I watched hours of footage. Different nights. Different employees. Same operation. They weren't sampling fruit. They weren't making mistakes. They were stealing. Systematically. Repeatedly. For months. The next morning I drove straight to the venue office carrying screenshots and video evidence. Preston didn't even look nervous. He watched the footage, leaned back in his chair, and smiled. Actually smiled. Then he said, Looks like people enjoy your apples. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I demanded payment, compensation, an apology, anything resembling accountability. Instead, he offered the exact same insulting deal he'd offered before. Exposure, marketing opportunities, discount pricing. When I refused again, he laughed and suggested neighbors should learn how to share local resources. That's when I realized this wasn't about apples anymore. This was about power. Preston genuinely believed people like him could take whatever they wanted from people like me because they assumed we'd never fight back. I gave him 1 week to pay for every apple his staff had stolen. 1 week before I contacted law enforcement and pursued civil action. He nodded, thanked me for my concern, and showed me the door. The following week, the thefts got worse. Much worse. Entire trees were getting harvested overnight. Thousands of dollars disappearing. And every weekend, Cedar Ridge Manor hosted another luxury wedding featuring handcrafted apple desserts that suspiciously resembled the fruit growing on my property. Then, one afternoon, I discovered something that changed everything. Preston's daughter was getting married at Cedar Ridge Manor in 6 weeks. 300 guests. Massive budget. Local media coverage. And according to one of the caterers who'd recently quit, the centerpiece dessert menu was going to feature heirloom apple pastries made from fruit that had never been legally purchased. That's when I stopped thinking about lawyers and started thinking about pigs. Now let me pause the story for a second, because this is where a lot of people misunderstand situations like this. They think the conflict is about apples. It isn't. The apples were just the symptom. The real issue was entitlement. This is a psychological trap that shows up whenever somebody with authority, money, or social status starts believing rules apply differently to them. Preston wasn't stealing because he needed apples. Cedar Ridge Manor generated millions in event revenue every year. He was stealing because, deep down, he convinced himself that my property existed to serve his business. According to standard procedure, when a business wants agricultural products, it negotiates a contract, agrees on a price, and pays for inventory. That's how civilized commerce works. From a legal perspective, crossing onto private property and removing agricultural products without permission isn't some harmless misunderstanding between neighbors. It's theft, trespassing, and potentially commercial conversion of property for profit. What made Preston especially dangerous wasn't the theft itself. It was the confidence. He honestly believed nobody would challenge him because he operated inside a world where reputation, connections, and expensive lawyers usually solve problems. The lesson here is that people often reveal who they truly are the moment they think they can act without consequences. And unfortunately for Preston, consequences were getting very close. The funny thing about farming is that it teaches patience whether you want to learn it or not. You can't rush rain. You can't rush harvest season. And sometimes you can't rush justice. So while Preston continued treating my orchard like his personal inventory warehouse, I stayed quiet. I kept collecting footage. I kept documenting losses. I kept saving every invoice, every photograph, every timestamp. The more evidence I gathered, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't a few employees sneaking fruit home. This was an organized operation. My apples were appearing everywhere at Cedar Ridge Manor. Apple tarts, apple centerpieces, decorative fruit displays, signature cocktail. Every event seemed to include another piece of my orchard, and every event generated profit for people who hadn't paid a dime for what they were using. About a month before the wedding, I attended a county agriculture meeting where I happened to run into one of the venue's former kitchen managers. We started talking, and eventually he told me something interesting. Apparently, Preston had become obsessed with impressing wealthy clients. Every wedding needed to feel bigger than the last one, more authentic, more exclusive, more luxurious. The irony was incredible. He wanted authenticity so badly that he was literally stealing from the actual farmer next door to create it. A week later, another piece of information landed in my lap. The wedding menu for his daughter's reception had been finalized. 7 courses. Premium catering, imported wines, custom desserts, and right there in the dessert section were heirloom apple galettes, apple tarts, and caramel apple pastries. My apples. Again, the same varieties visible on security footage. The same fruit being carried across my property line night after night. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at those menu details while one of my Mangalitsa pigs snored outside the window. That's when an idea started forming. Not a reckless idea, not a dangerous idea, just an educational opportunity. See, I raised heritage pigs on part of my farm. 40 of them. Some Gloucester old spots. Some Mangalitsas. Friendly animals, mostly. Smart too. Smarter than many people realize. But they shared one particular personality trait. When they smelled food, especially sweet food, they became extremely motivated. The wedding date arrived on a warm Saturday afternoon in early September. Perfect weather. Blue skies. Expensive decorations everywhere. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Guests arrived in designer suits and dresses. The entire venue looked like a magazine advertisement. Around 4 o'clock, I climbed onto a small hill overlooking part of the property from my side of the fence. From there I could see the reception area. White tents, flower arrangements, a massive wedding cake that looked tall enough to require building permits. Caterers moved back and forth carrying trays. Musicians played near the garden. Everything appeared flawless. Then I noticed something that made me laugh out loud. Decorative apple displays sat on several tables. I didn't even need binoculars to recognize the varieties. They were mine. The same heirloom apples Preston had spent months stealing. Right there in plain sight, showing off stolen property to hundreds of guests. At that moment, I realized something important. Preston had become so comfortable crossing boundaries that he no longer bothered hiding it. That kind of arrogance usually comes right before disaster. Around 6:30, the reception shifted into full celebration mode. Champagne flowed. Dinner was served. Speeches started. Music got louder. And somewhere beyond the hedge, separating part of my pasture from the venue grounds, 40 pigs were enjoying a perfectly normal afternoon. Then the wind changed direction. Anyone who has raised pigs knows what happened next. The scent of food drifted directly across the property line. Cake, pastries, fruit, roasted meats, sugar, butter, every delicious smell imaginable. The pigs became interested immediately. Very interested. Now here's the part that usually makes people smile. I didn't lead them into the wedding. I didn't chase them. I didn't force anything. I simply opened a pasture access gate that happened to connect sections of my own property. What happened afterward was a combination of curiosity, opportunity, and 40 highly food-motivated animals making independent decisions. The first pig squeezed through a gap near the hedge. Then another followed. Then 10 more. Then suddenly an entire wave of spotted and woolly hogs emerged from the greenery, like some kind of agricultural cavalry charge. For about 3 seconds, nobody understood what they were seeing. Guests stared. Waiters froze. The band stopped playing. Then one pig reached a dessert table. Everything changed. Plates flew. Decorations crashed. Guests scattered in every direction. The pigs discovered paradise. Cakes, pastries, fruit displays, bread baskets, appetizers. If a professional wedding planner sat down and designed the perfect pig amusement park, it would have looked exactly like that reception. One enormous Mangalitsa buried its face directly into the wedding cake. Another knocked over an ice sculpture. Several others charged through floral arrangements while guests shrieked and climbed onto chairs. The scene was absolute chaos. I watched a groomsman sprint across the lawn holding his suit jacket over his head while 2 pigs chased him because he'd been carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. A bridesmaid lost a shoe. Someone jumped into a decorative fountain. One pig somehow ended up inside the dance floor tent. The musicians abandoned their instruments and ran. Through all of this, the pigs looked like they were having the greatest day of their lives. Then came the moment everyone still talks about. Preston finally spotted me standing near the fence line. His face turned a shade of red I didn't know human skin could achieve. He pulled out his phone and called me immediately. The second I answered, he started screaming. "Get your animals out of here right now," he shouted. Behind him, I could see 3 pigs attacking what remained of the wedding cake. I listened patiently. Then I said, very calmly, "That's strange, Preston. They must have smelled my apples." Silence. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stared. And in that moment, I knew he understood exactly what I meant. Every stolen apple, every arrogant comment, every trespass, every threat, it all landed at once. The reception effectively ended within the hour. Guests left early. Vendors packed equipment. The venue staff spent the rest of the evening trying to restore order. Meanwhile, my pigs eventually wandered back toward familiar pasture areas once the food excitement faded. The real consequences started a few days later. The wedding disaster attracted attention. Lots of attention. Insurance investigators became involved because the property damage was substantial. Several guests reported minor injuries while running from the commotion. Vendors demanded compensation. Questions started getting asked. During those investigations, evidence surfaced regarding the venue's ingredient sourcing. Then my documentation entered the conversation. Security footage, photographs, inventory records, trespassing evidence, witness statements. Suddenly, what had looked like an unfortunate wedding accident became part of a much larger story. From a legal perspective, the venue found itself standing on extremely thin ice. Insurance companies are many things, but charitable is not one of them. Once allegations of stolen agricultural products entered the picture, coverage disputes appeared almost immediately. Lawyers became involved. Board members became nervous. Investors became concerned. Within days, Preston was no longer the events director. Within weeks, Cedar Ridge Manor contacted me through attorneys seeking a settlement. Funny how quickly people discover respect after months of ignoring it. The final agreement included compensation for stolen crops, reimbursement for documented losses, legal expenses, and a long-term purchasing contract for future harvests at legitimate market rates. In other words, they ended up paying far more than they would have if Preston had simply bought the apples honestly from the beginning. As for Preston himself, the last thing I heard was that he moved several states away after the fallout damaged his professional reputation. And every time I walk through my orchard now, especially during harvest season, I can't help smiling a little when I remember the look on his face while 40 pigs enjoyed the most expensive buffet of their lives. A few months after everything settled down, life returned to normal in the orchard. The trees didn't care about lawsuits. They didn't care about wedding disasters. They just kept doing what apple trees have always done, growing quietly while people around them created unnecessary drama. Every morning, I'd walk the rows with a cup of coffee, checking branches, watching the fruit develop, and thinking about how strange the entire situation had been. What stayed with me wasn't the chaos of the wedding or even the settlement money. It was how avoidable the whole thing was. Preston could have gotten exactly what he wanted from the very beginning. If he'd approached me honestly, respected my work, and offered a fair price, we probably would have built a successful partnership. Instead, he chose shortcuts. And shortcuts have a funny habit of becoming detours straight into disaster. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere, not just in farming. Sometimes people become so focused on getting what they want that they stop asking whether they're entitled to it in the first place. The more successful they become, the more dangerous that mindset gets. They start confusing access with ownership. They start confusing influence with permission. Eventually, they convince themselves that rules are obstacles designed for other people. Preston didn't wake up one morning planning to destroy his career. Most people don't. Usually it happens one small decision at a time. One rationalization, one excuse, one boundary crossed, then another. Before long, behavior that would have seemed outrageous a year earlier starts feeling normal. According to standard procedure, healthy relationships between neighbors, businesses, and communities depend on mutual respect. Property rights aren't complicated. If something belongs to somebody else, you ask. If they say no, you respect the answer. The moment someone decides their desires matter more than someone else's rights, conflict becomes almost inevitable. From a legal perspective, that's why documentation matters so much. One lesson I learned through all this is that emotions alone rarely solve disputes. Evidence does. Had I relied only on accusations, the story might have ended very differently. The cameras mattered. The records mattered. The patience mattered. Sometimes the strongest response isn't the fastest response. Sometimes it's simply allowing the truth enough time to reveal itself. The lesson here is that accountability eventually catches up with most people, especially when arrogance convinces them they're untouchable. And honestly, that's probably the part of the story people enjoy the most. Not the pigs, not the wedding, not even the chaos. It's the fact that someone who spent months taking advantage of others finally encountered consequences he couldn't negotiate away. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting every neighborhood dispute should involve livestock. Please don't take that as legal advice. But I do think there's something satisfying about seeing justice arrive in a form nobody expects. Sometimes it comes through courts, sometimes through contracts, sometimes through simple exposure of the truth. And occasionally, apparently, it arrives on four legs covered in mud. Looking back, I don't feel angry anymore. Mostly I feel grateful. Grateful that I protected my orchard. Grateful that my father's legacy remained intact. Grateful that I stood my ground when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Because silence has a cost too, and people who count on your silence usually become very uncomfortable when you finally decide to speak. So now I'd love to hear what you think. If you were in my position, what would you have done after discovering months of theft? Would you have gone straight to court? Called the police immediately? Tried negotiating one last time? Or do you think Preston's wedding disaster was exactly the wake-up call he earned? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious where people draw that line between patience and action. And if there's one thing this entire experience taught me, it's that respect costs far less than arrogance. One creates opportunities. The other creates consequences. And trust me, consequences are usually a lot more expensive.